All right, let's bring our jurors in, please. Opening statement. Mr. Haggan.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning. Monday, July 16th, the year 2012. It was a warm summer night in downtown Boston, the Theater District. It was a Sunday night leading into a Monday morning. The hustle and bustle of that area, the Theater District, with clubs and bars and theaters, was much less on this night. There wasn't as much traffic. There weren't as many people around because, again, it was a Monday morning. And all in all, you'll learn that it was relatively quiet that night, the early morning hours of July 16, 2012. At about 2:30, July 16, 2012, that relative quiet would be shattered suddenly by the crackle of gunfire. And what you will soon learn from the evidence in this case is the terrible and appalling story that gunfire marked, and ultimately that this case will tell. The story of this case, ladies and gentlemen, in many ways begins with a story of two very different worlds. Different people from different worlds, different life experiences. Different worlds that came together in the early morning hours of July 16, 2012. One world was that of working class immigrants, relatively recently in this country, not as experienced in the Boston night scene. The other world was that of a professional athlete, a celebrity in the city of Boston. And by pure coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, those two worlds collided, interacted in those early morning hours of July 16, 2012. Complete strangers to one another. A complete chance encounter. And an interaction between those two worlds that to almost anybody would be simply trivial, innocent, forgettable, or at worst, annoying. You will soon know was anything but trivial and innocent to one man. And to that one man, it was something that was not going to be forgotten. Ladies and gentlemen, what started as an interaction, which was a simple bump, a spilled drink, and an exchange of looks thereafter, ended hours later in what the evidence will show was a cold-blooded, senseless, and deadly act of violence. 2 hours after that initial harmless interaction, two men's lives were snuffed out in a hail of gunfire. A hail of gunfire fired by one man who set upon those two victims as they sat in their car at a stoplight, waiting to go home after the club. One man who took the opportunity to redress the insult that he felt had happened sooner. One man who the evidence will show was fueled by an irrational yet very real sense of disrespect, of being tried, of being tested. One man who took that misperception to the ultimate level of violence, murder. And ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence in this case will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the person I'm referring to, the one man, sits before you today, the defendant, Hernandez. I said, ladies and gentlemen, it's two worlds involved in this case. One world was that of the two men I just spoke of, who now will be named. Daniel D'Abreu and Safiro Furtado. Those are the two men who lost their lives on that city street in the hail of gunfire. 29-year-old Daniel D'Abreu, 28-year-old Safiro Furtado. You will learn from the evidence from this witness stand. Hard-working immigrants from the country of Cape Verde. Daniel D'Abreu had been here since 2008. In Cape Verde, you'll learn that he was a police officer. He had military experience. He came here to be with family in 2008, hoping to make his life here in America. 28-year-old Safiro Furtado had only been in the country since December of 2011, just a few months. You'll learn in Cape Verde he was a tour guide, and that he came here again to be with family, to hopefully stay with family and to live the American dream. These men on the Sunday, July 15th, 2012, it was a typical night for this group of immigrants from Cape Verde. They got together at a cookout in Dorchester. Old friends got together. Phone calls were made. You'll see, ladies and gentlemen, it was a relatively unique night for this group of Cape Verdean friends. Most of them worked multiple jobs. Safiro Furtado worked the overnight shift cleaning businesses. Daniel D'Abreu worked 3 different jobs cleaning. And again, they all worked the overnight shift. But it was Sunday night, and they didn't have to work. You'll learn the only impediment was that Safiro Furtado had a soccer game the next day, and he wasn't going to drink. You'll learn that they hung out together at a cookout, and at some point they decided to go out to clubs. You'll learn that for many in this group of 5 Cape Verdean friends, many had not even been to this area of the theater district, had never been to a club called Club Cure. But they got together to spend a night out with friends. But they didn't have a way to get there. You'll learn from the evidence that Daniel D'Abreu borrowed the 2003 BMW from his sister, and the 5 young friends jumped into the car and went to Club Cure. You'll learn that they parked in the parking garage on Tremont Street. Parking garage you'll see many photos of and hear lots of testimony about. You'll be able to watch video as this group of young men from Cape Verde all walk in to Club Cure. You'll learn that they waited in line at Club Cure. They paid a $25 cover to enter. And the 5 friends entered that club, completely unaware, completely oblivious to the celebrity that was walking in right behind them. Completely unaware that 2 of them would have just hours left to live. That's the one world that came to Club Cure in the early morning hours of July 16, 2012. The other world, that of the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, star athlete, professional football player for the New England Patriots, a recognizable celebrity not only on the streets or based on TV, but most importantly recognizable in the nightclubs of Boston where he frequented. Aaron Hernandez, doing exceptionally well, his career blossoming. You'll learn from the evidence he was soon to sign a multi-million-dollar contract for the New England Patriots. That Sunday night leading into Monday morning, July 16, 2012, the defendant Aaron Hernandez just got back from 10 days in Costa Rica with a friend, and when he arrived, he landed in his home state of Connecticut. You'll learn from the evidence that Aaron Hernandez, born and raised in Bristol, Connecticut. Friends are there, family's there. And when he arrived at Bradley International Airport sometime on Sunday the 15th, he called somebody who's very important to this case. He called what the evidence will show is perhaps his very best friend in that time period, a man named Alexander Bradley. Alexander Bradley, ladies and gentlemen, you will hear an awful lot about in this case. One important point to keep in mind right now is that Alexander Bradley was one of his very best friends. You will learn that they were so close at that time that there was even talk about making Alexander Bradley the godchild of the child that Mr. Hernandez, the defendant, was expecting. They were very close. They spent a lot of time together. There's another very important fact that you should know about Alexander Bradley, what his profession was. He was a marijuana dealer. And as you learn from the evidence, he was quite successful at it. He did well, he made a lot of money. And you'll also learn from this evidence, ladies and gentlemen, who one of his customers was. The defendant, Aaron Hernandez. And you'll learn a lot about their relationship leading up to that fateful night of Monday, July 16, 2012. You'll learn that Alexander Bradley and Aaron Hernandez had a lot in common, that they like to do the same things. And those things, more often than not, consisted of playing video games, smoking marijuana, and going to nightclubs. And that is what they did frequently. And that's going to be a very important fact as you weigh and listen to the testimony of Alexander Bradley. But this particular night, ladies and gentlemen, was a Sunday night. It was not unusual for Alexander Bradley and the defendant to go out on a Sunday night. It was actually quite common, particularly during the football season when Mr. Hernandez would have at home games. They would often go out on Sunday nights. But this particular Sunday night, July 15, 2012, the defendant called Alexander Bradley in Hartford and asked him if he wanted to step out, which was a word for going out together to clubs. And Mr. Bradley agreed. You'll learn from the evidence that at some point around 10 o'clock on the 15th, the Sunday night, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, picked up Alexander Bradley in a certain car. A car that's very important to this case. Because unlike Daniel D'Abreu, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, did not have to borrow a car to get to the club. The defendant, Aaron Hernandez, had a black Range Rover, but most importantly this night, he had a 2006 silver Toyota 4Runner SUV with Rhode Island plates. It was a car the defendant had received as part of a promotion with a Rhode Island car dealership. And what you'll learn that means is that the owner of the dealership, in exchange for having football signed, getting tickets to games, gave Mr. Hernandez the use of a free car for whatever he wanted, he and his fiancee to use or whoever else. And that was the car that they were using that night. So, Sunday night was typical for them to go out. But there was one unusual thing that happened at the beginning of their night out together at about 10 o'clock when they were leaving Mr. Bradley's apartment in Manchester, Connecticut. The defendant, Aaron Hernandez, took out a gun. The gun that the evidence will show was a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. He took out that gun and he placed it in the engine block of that Toyota 4Runner. And you will learn that this did not surprise Alexander Bradley. Again, he was a drug dealer. You'll learn that he has knowledge of firearms. He had the ability to access firearms himself. You will learn that, in fact, Alexander Bradley had purchased a silver revolver for the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, just 2 months prior. And you'll learn from Alexander Bradley exactly why he was asked to purchase that firearm 2 months prior. Because the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, felt threatened. He felt tried, he felt tested, particularly when he went out to Boston nightclubs. So there you have it at about 10 o'clock. They get in that car, they drive up to the city of Boston. Ironically, and again, purely by coincidence, they park in the exact same garage as the victims in the case, Safira Furtado, Daniel D'Abreu, and their 3 friends. They enter the club together. They don't know each other. They are perfect strangers. You're going to hear from the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that when Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley got to the front of the club, the victims were right there. But Alexander Bradley and Aaron Hernandez did not have to wait in line. They did not have to pay a cover. A VIP host came to them and led them into the club, right past the victims, right downstairs. The VIP host's entire job was to bring in celebrities and sports stars to take care of them. And typically, as you'll learn, a defendant and whomever he was with, whether it was Alexander Bradley or someone else, they would spend a lot of time in Club Cure, multiple hours. But soon you will know that on this night, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley, spent 10 minutes in that club. And soon you will know from the evidence that there's a real reason why they're only in the club for 10 minutes. You'll hear from multiple witnesses about what happened downstairs in that club, that the group of victims, Safira Furtado, Daniel D'Abreu, they split off from their 3 other friends, they got drinks, and at some point, Daniel D'Abreu was dancing in the club. You're not supposed to dance, you'll learn, but he was dancing just the same. And at some point, when they were only in the club for about 5 minutes, Daniel D'Abreu danced into Aaron Hernandez, and he spilled his drink. You'll hear testimony, not only from Alexander Bradley, but from others in that club that saw an interaction between the defendant and Daniel D'Abreu, and Safira Furtado was with him. He spilled his drink. Now that to you may sound like nothing, but what you will soon learn from this case, ladies and gentlemen, is that the seeds of this murder were planted long before the early morning hours of July 16, 2012. The seeds for this murder were planted months, if not a whole year before. Because you'll hear evidence from Mr. Bradley, perhaps other evidence, that will tell you that in the months before this murder, there were multiple times where the defendant would express the fact that he felt tried, he felt tested, he felt disrespected, he felt threatened when he was out. You'll hear specific instances where just somebody staring at him the wrong way would lead him to get agitated, would lead him to get upset, would lead him to get angry. You'll even hear specific examples where even after a football loss, a big football loss, people would say things to him. And unlike perhaps other athletes or who get the types of questions, he wouldn't brush it off. It wouldn't just go off his shoulders. You'll hear specific examples where that angered him, and he had verbal and nearly physical altercations on multiple occasions in clubs, mostly in Boston, but also elsewhere. That he always felt he was being tried and he was being tested. This particular night, and again, you'll see the video of them leaving the club. Aaron Hernandez was agitated. He was upset. He was angry. And it wasn't so much the fact that Daniel D'Abreu just bumped into him and spilled his drink. You're going to learn that Daniel D'Abreu turned to him afterwards and smiled. And that to Aaron Hernandez, that smile said it all. That was a sign of disrespect. And Aaron Hernandez was furious. You will watch on video, ladies and gentlemen, the outside of the club as Alexander Bradley takes Aaron Hernandez out of the club, and you're going to watch over multiple minutes on that video, surveillance video. You're going to see Alexander Bradley doing what he will tell each and every one of you he had done countless times before, trying to calm Aaron Hernandez down, trying to tell him that just because somebody looks at you a certain way doesn't mean they're testing you, doesn't mean they're trying you. You'll hear Alexander Bradley say that he told Aaron Hernandez, "You're a football star. You can't be getting engaged in these types of things. It doesn't mean what you think it does. Relax, mellow out," you will hear him say. And on that video, there's no audio, it's just video. But I suspect when you have a chance to watch that, the movements will be very clear to you. You will see Alexander Bradley moving like this repeatedly. You'll see Aaron Hernandez walking back and forth, pacing, because he's being talked down. You'll hear evidence and you'll watch that video, you'll see that they almost leave. They almost go back to the parking garage to leave for the night. They just driven 2 hours and they're going to leave. And that's because Aaron Hernandez was so upset. But you'll learn that Alexander Bradley did talk him down and they decided to go to another club across the street. And then something else happened. You'll learn from the evidence that Aaron Hernandez, the defendant, somehow convinced himself that the victims, Daniel D'Abreu, Zafiro Furtado, and their friends, they were coming over to the club too. And he mentioned that to Alexander Bradley, and he said, "They're following me. Look, see, they're trying me, they're testing me." And the irony here, ladies and gentlemen, is that was completely false. You will learn from indisputable evidence that the victims in this case never left Club Pure until it closed at 2:30. But in his mind, they did. And in his mind, he was being followed, he was being tried, and he was being tested. You'll hear from the evidence that he left that club as well. Again, a similar conversation with Alexander Bradley. You'll learn that over the next hour, they drove around the neighborhood of the theater district. They stopped and got rolling papers. They smoked marijuana. They parked somewhere. And at 2:30, which is often known as the let-out, the time that the clubs get out, you'll learn that they had left the parking garage. Alexander Bradley at that point was in the passenger seat. Aaron Hernandez was driving. They stopped, pulled over. Aaron Hernandez went to the engine block. You'll learn that he came back from the engine block with the revolver, the silver revolver, and placed it in the glove box. At that point, they had switched seats. And at this point, Aaron Hernandez was in the passenger seat and Alexander Bradley was driving. At 2:30 in the morning, the club lets out. You'll hear from the surviving victims and from multiple people that the night at Cure was anything but remarkable. It was a quiet night. Nothing happened downstairs. Safira Furtado and Daniel D'Abreu's friends didn't even see this interaction with the defendant. Daniel D'Abreu and Safira Furtado never mentioned anything or made any gestures as if they were having a problem with anybody. They left that club. You'll watch video of the outside. Daniel D'Abreu was talking to a young woman, was just milling about. But you're going to notice one thing on that video. You're going to notice a silver SUV. Circles the block, drives by the victims very slowly, 2 times. You're going to learn and you're going to see that that SUV drove ahead, pulled over, and parked a distance away from the parking garage, the Tufts parking garage. Then you're going to learn that Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley got out of the car and walked towards the parking garage. Now Alexander Bradley is going to tell you that he believed they were going to go just try to pick up women. But it'll be clear to you from the evidence that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, had different intentions. You'll watch on the video as Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley walk up to the parking garage while 3 of the friends of the victim stand and wait for the BMW to come down out of the garage. A few of them had gone up to get the car and the others are waiting. And Aaron Hernandez was waiting too. And you'll hear testimony and you can watch the evidence on video that as the victims got into that car, the 2003 BMW, you will see the defendant, Aaron Hernandez and Alexander Bradley, off in a distance, very pixelated, but they're standing right there. You will learn that at that point, the person who in all the evidence you hear in this case is always leading the show, who's always the leader telling people what to do, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, told Alexander Bradley, get in the car, let's go. Bradley will tell you he wasn't quite sure exactly what he was talking about, but he did what he was told. He got into the car, and he drove up to the next intersection. Aaron Hernandez said, there they go, and pointed to the silver 2003 BMW that the victims were in. Daniel D'Abreu was driving, Safira Furtado was a passenger. In the back seat was a man named Mercedes Sanchez, Gerson Lopes, and Aquilino Ferrer in the middle. You don't have to remember those names, obviously, at this point. 5 of them in the car. They had a good night. Some of them will tell you they were a little buzzed from drinking, but overall, everything was fine. They were going to get food in Dorchester, trying to find an all-night place where they could get food. They had the music on the radio. Most of the windows were down in the car. And they're just driving home. They're coming down Tremont Street. It turns into Shawmut. It goes over the Mass Pike, and there's a stoplight there. A place where I expect soon each and every one of you will stand when we do the view. The intersection of Shawmut and Harold Street in the South End. And as the victim's car stopped there, again, the victim is just talking and listening to music. You'll hear the evidence that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, and Alexander Bradley pulled right up to that car. Alexander Bradley will tell you he knew that the defendant wanted to confront them, but he'll tell you that he had no idea what was going to happen next. Aaron Hernandez, when that car pulled over right alongside the victim's car, leaned out from the passenger seat, took the gun out of the glove compartment, extended his body out the driver's window, and he said, yo. And he didn't say yo just once. You'll learn from the evidence, and the evidence will show that he wanted the victims in this case to see what was coming. That when he first said yo, and the victims hadn't looked yet, he said it again, until Safira Furtado looked to his right. And he said, yo, what's up now? And a racial slur, the N-word. And immediately after saying, yo, what's up now, and that slur, he didn't wait for a response. The evidence will show that at that point the defendant fired that gun 5 times. Bang, 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 bang. And you'll hear evidence that even after that gun was out of bullets, that he continued to pull that revolver as it clicked and clicked. That he shot 5 shots into the car. But he intended, from the evidence you will hear, to fire much more. And you will learn from the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that he had deadly accuracy in those 5 shots that he fired into that car. 2 of the bullets struck Safira Furtado in his head. 1 of the bullets lodged in his brain. Another bullet went straight through his head and into a headrest on the other side of the car. A 3rd bullet hit Safira Furtado in his shoulder, went out his back. And thankfully for Aquilino Ferrer, the backseat middle passenger, that bullet had lost a lot of velocity, or perhaps he'd be dead, because that bullet ended up hitting him in the arm and luckily only causing a flesh wound. 2 more shots from the defendant's revolver struck his intended target, the person who had bumped him in the very beginning of that night, Daniel D'Abreu. 2 bullets to the chest, ripping into his chest, going through his heart and his lungs. The defendant had deadly accuracy that night. And you will learn from the evidence that Safira Furtado basically died instantly in that car. The 2 shots to the head killed him within seconds. But for Daniel D'Abreu, the evidence you will hear in this case is that he was not killed instantly. That those wounds to his chest caused his death not within seconds, but within minutes. You will not only hear medical testimony about that, you will hear testimony from the survivors of that car who will testify to him gasping for air prior to dying in that car. You will hear evidence that after the shooting, the defendant said, "Go, go, go." And as always, Alexander Bradley did what he was told. He drove that car away. And they fled that scene. You'll hear evidence that as they were driving away from the scene, they got onto the Massachusetts Pike. The defendant said to Bradley in a bragging way, I got 2. I got 1 in the chest, I got 1 in the head. You'll hear evidence that as he's dragging up the Massachusetts Turnpike, Alexander Bradley will tell you that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, threw evidence out the window, clothing, dumped the shell casings out of the gun. Alexander Bradley actually is convinced he threw the murder weapon out of the car as well. But you'll know from the evidence that that's not exactly accurate. At this point, while they're driving down the Massachusetts Turnpike, police officers, EMTs are arriving on the scene. While they're sheeting the bodies, leaving the bodies of Daniel D'Abreu and Safira Furtado at that scene, and covering it with sheets out of dignity and respect, the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, was making good his escape and getting rid of evidence. You'll learn that they drove all the way back to Connecticut, to Hartford, to Alexander Bradley's girlfriend's house. You'll hear testimony from her. She'll tell you about the very odd early morning visit from her boyfriend, Alexander Bradley, and the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. The evidence will show that Aaron Hernandez wanted to know what the police did. You'll hear evidence that he used the girlfriend's laptop. He searched for shootings on the internet. You'll see evidence of that from the laptops. You'll learn that he turned on the news to see if there was any description of the car. Aaron Hernandez knew what he had done. The evidence will show he was trying to get away with it. You will know that the attempt to cover up went much, much further than just that night. You'll learn that at about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning, the defendant placed a phone call you will see evidence of, to his most trusted and dearest relative, perhaps I would suggest. The woman whose name you'll hear in this case, it's his cousin. Their name was Tanya Singleton. You will learn that Tanya Singleton was, again, perhaps the closest family member to Aaron Hernandez, somebody he trusted more than anyone, somebody who he's closest to, and somebody, ladies and gentlemen, who lived at a very important address in this case, the address of 114 Lake Avenue in Bristol, Connecticut. You'll learn that that's where Tanya Cummings Singleton grew up, was raised, and you'll learn that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, as he grew up and was raised, spent a lot of time there at that house. It was like a second home to him, particularly when his father died when he was in high school. He spent countless hours there. He spent countless time with Tanya Cummings Singleton. So who did he call on this night after he had just shot and killed 2 people, wounded a 3rd, almost killed the others in the car? He called Tanya Singleton. And you'll learn from the evidence, not only from Mr. Bradley, but from the girlfriend as well, that Tanya Cummings Singleton, at about 9, 10 o'clock that morning, she showed up at the apartment. She took that car. It's silver 2006 Toyota 4Runner with the Rhode Island plates. And she left another car for the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. And you'll hear evidence that at that point, that car simply vanished. What you will know from the evidence is that Aaron Hernandez instructed Tanya to take that car, to clean it, and to hide it. You will hear that from Alexander Bradley's mouth, from the defendant's mouth. And the evidence will show that Tanya Cummings Singleton in an act of loyalty, did exactly that. The evidence will show that from that night, the morning after the murder, that car, that silver SUV that the defendant used to use all the time, that his fiancée used to use, that car vanished off the grid. And that's because it was stuck, placed into a garage at guess where? 114 Lake Ave. In that garage, painted white windows that you would only be able to see the car in the garage if you walked right up to the windows. That's where that car was hidden, because you will know from the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that was the murder car. The murder car was now hidden. The murder weapon was somewhere hidden. And the defendant's efforts to cover his tracks didn't end there. You'll learn that shortly after getting his cousin to take the murder car and hide it, the defendant's cell phone, which you'll see plenty of evidence about what the phone number was, the phone, it simply went off the grid. It went dark for 2 days. You will see the phone records. Other than 2 times that he actually checks messages, that phone is not on the grid. And that will only mean a couple of things, ladies and gentlemen. I'll make that argument to you in closing. But that phone off for 2 full days. And it goes beyond that, ladies and gentlemen, because by the end of August, that phone, an iPhone with a certain particular number that experts can link, that phone ended up completely off the grid forever. What I mean by that is, according to AT&T, you'll hear evidence that that phone was never, ever used again, not only by Mr. Hernandez, but by anybody else, because cell phones have a unique identifying number. If you sell it, you give it to a family member or friend, that's going to pop up on the grid. That phone was basically disposed of by the defendant, and it was lost. He did that on purpose, the evidence will show, to cover his tracks. Now, ladies and gentlemen, one theme that you'll see throughout the case, if you haven't already figured out from the statement I'm giving you now, is that many times the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, was about to get away with murder. And one such time is right about where I'm talking about now, late August into September 2012. The murder car was hidden. The murder weapon was hidden. There were no ties to his phone. The police investigation began to stall. You'll learn from the evidence, and I expect Mr. Baez will talk a lot about the police investigation, what was adequate, what wasn't. But you'll learn that the police scoured that neighborhood. They had a description from one of the survivors inside of the car that you'll hear about, Mercedes Sanchez, who's closest to the suspect car as the shooting happens. He described the shooter as a white, American-looking boy with a baseball hat. That's the description he had. You'll hear that there were witnesses that you'll hear from in this case who watched the shooting happen from 1 block away on Marginal Street, who will tell you that the shooting car was absolutely a silver SUV with Rhode Island plates. They thought it was a Pathfinder or a 4Runner, both of which look similar. So they had a description of a white male, again, but that didn't narrow it down very much. But one description that the white male helps you with, ladies and gentlemen, as you consider this case, is that description will not be consistent, you will learn, with what Alexander Bradley looks like. You'll learn from the evidence that Alexander Bradley is an African American. So the police had a type of car, an SUV, silver. They had a general description of the shooter. They knew that it was Rhode Island plates. You'll learn that they pulled every bit of video they could find all along Tremont Street, all the surrounding streets, any businesses. They pulled Cure's video. I expect there's going to be a lot of conversations and evidence about Cure video and whether they had downstairs video that worked and whether it didn't. That's not going to matter, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, I suggest the evidence will show the police acted reasonably. They got every bit of video they could. And the video was helpful. But unfortunately, the video, you will learn, led the police in the wrong direction, much to the benefit of the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. Because the police saw a silver SUV coming down the street shortly after the victims had pulled out, and they focused on that. And they zoomed in pictures, they went to dealerships to try to figure out what kind of car that was, and they were told it was a Hyundai Santa Fe. See, ladies and gentlemen, the police did not have the benefit of knowing that that car that had circled probably about 15, 20 minutes prior and pulled off into the distance and pulled into a parking spot barely in the view of the camera. They had no idea that that was the car that was involved. So they focused on the Hyundai Santa Fe. They pulled records from Rhode Island, find any Santa Fe's that possibly fit the description. They went to Club Cure. They got licenses of everybody who showed their license, everybody who came to the club the entire night. They cross-referenced those with the registry records from Rhode Island. They tried to solve the case, but the case stalled. And the defendant, like I said, the evidence will show he was getting away with murder. You'll hear evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that the fact that he had gotten away with murder up until that point changed the defendant's behavior. You'll hear evidence, mostly from Mr. Bradley, or perhaps other sources, about the defendant at that point continuing to try to cover his tracks, continuing to try to make sure that the police never found out what he did. You'll hear some crazy type of things, ladies and gentlemen. You're going to hear that he stopped wanting to use iPhones, that he didn't even want anybody around him to use iPhones. You're learning he had heard some security briefing given to the Patriots where they were told that you could track people via their iPhones. And the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, was paranoid of anyone who had iPhones. You'll learn specific instances where he would be out at clubs with Alexander Bradley, perhaps with others, where he would say, that person's staring at me, that person's in a suit, they must be the police, they must be following me. He thought helicopters were following him. You'll hear testimony about that. He thought everybody around him, except those he most trusted, were the police. And he would express that he thought it was only a matter of time before the police somehow found him, and he was vigilant and looking for them at all times. So ladies and gentlemen, there we are, 2012, leading into 2013. The football season's over. Aaron Hernandez, at that point, had gotten away with murder. The murder car was hidden. The murder weapon was hidden. The phones were gone. And there was one other thing I forgot to mention, ladies and gentlemen. The day after the murder, the 17th of July, 2012, what do you know? The defendant, Aaron Hernandez, rented a new car from Enterprise Rental the day after the murder. So he had done all these things to cover his tracks. But what you'll learn, ladies and gentlemen, from the evidence is that there was still one problem. There was still one problem for Aaron Hernandez. There was one loose end. There was one liability. Again, he hadn't been questioned by police. Police hadn't found the car. He had gone back to Cure multiple times between the murder in 2013. Nothing was happening. But there was one loose end, one problem. Ladies and gentlemen, from the evidence in this case, you will know that the loose end, the problem in this case, was Alexander Bradley. Alexander Bradley knew everything, and the defendant knew that. You will know from the evidence that that came into full focus for the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, in February of 2013. Up until then, he could trust Alexander Bradley. You're going to learn a lot about Alexander Bradley. The good, the bad, the ugly. Some of it you won't like at all. In addition to being a drug dealer and having certain crimes that he's been convicted with, he is street code. You may not like that. He will get on that witness stand and he will tell you, I never in a million years was ever going to tell the police anything. That's not what you do where I come from. You don't tell the police anything ever. But Alexander Bradley will admit to you, I expect, on that witness stand, that there was another reason why he would never go to the police and come forward. Because Alexander Bradley, if nothing else you see from him on that witness stand when he testifies, you will know that he's very smart. He's intelligent. He will tell you that he knew that he was a driver in that car. And he knew that he drove the car during a murder and that he would have accountability for that. So again, Alexander Bradley was never going to tell a soul about the horrible events of July 16, 2012. But Aaron Hernandez, you'll learn, didn't care about that. Because something happened in February 2013 to make Aaron Hernandez realize Alexander Bradley could no longer be trusted. You will learn from the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that on February 8, 2013, the defendant, again, still very friendly with Alexander Bradley, still hanging out regularly, took him to a Super Bowl party put on by a football friend of the defendant's named Deontay Thompson. His football team, the Baltimore Ravens, had just won the Super Bowl. And there was a party going on down in Belgrade, Florida. And Alexander Bradley and Aaron Hernandez went on that trip together. You'll hear the fact they got in on the 8th, they went to a party, Super Bowl party, they went to multiple clubs over the nights, they went to a strip club, they went to Tootsie's Cabaret twice in that time period. Most importantly, you're going to learn from the evidence, ladies and gentlemen, that on the night before, February 13th, 2013, February 12th, 2013, they were at a club together, the defendant and Alexander Bradley. And as you'll hear would often happen, the defendant pointed to some random white men in suits and said to Alexander Bradley, "See those guys over there? Those are probably cops. Those are probably feds." And Alexander Bradley, you will learn from the evidence, made a crucial mistake that almost cost him his life. He turned to Aaron Hernandez and he said, "Yeah, they probably are. And it's probably because of the effed up stuff you did in Boston last summer." You'll hear from Alexander Bradley what the defendant's reaction was to that. It was a look. It was a look of anger. And you will know from the evidence, it was a look of distrust. The evidence will show that at that point, Aaron Hernandez knew that he could no longer trust Alexander Bradley. How dare him mention the fact of what he had done, the unspeakable that they were never supposed to speak of. How dare him? And 24 hours later, Alexander Bradley would have a bullet in his head from a gun fired by that defendant, Aaron Hernandez. 24 hours later, after making that comment, because of the effed up stuff you did up in Boston. Because what happened the next day, they went to a strip club again called Tootsie's. They were there all night. They had an argument about the bill. It was a $10,000 bill. The defendant wanted Alexander Bradley to split. They had an argument. They got into a car. They were driving back to the hotel. And you'll notice another important thing about the time of the shooting of Alexander Bradley in Florida, February 13, 2013. When that shooting happens, you're going to notice something very interesting about the defendant's cell phone. Once again, it goes dark. From midnight till about 7 in the morning. Not on any network. We'll talk about that in closing argument. But as Alexander Bradley is riding in the back of a car, Aaron Hernandez is in the passenger seat, 2 other individuals are in the car as well, friends of Aaron Hernandez's. There's an argument. Alexander Bradley falls asleep. And when he wakes up, the car is stopped, and the car is in an abandoned parking lot in an industrial section of Riviera Beach, Florida, just part of, or on the outskirts of West Palm Beach, in a deserted parking lot. And Alexander Bradley has a gun, a black .40 caliber semi-automatic handgun, pointed in his face. And it's pointed and being held by the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. You will learn that before Bradley could even say a word, the defendant pulled the trigger and shot him point blank range right between the eyes. You will learn that it's an absolute miracle in many ways that Alexander Bradley survived that shooting. He put his hand up just as the bullet was being fired. That bullet took his thumb off, essentially, mostly off. It went into his nose, ripped out his right eye. Fragments from that bullet came out his temple. You will see pictures of Alexander Bradley. And if there's one thing you'll notice about those pictures, he looks dead. And that's hours later in the hospital. The evidence will show that the defendant, Aaron Hernandez, thought he was dead. When they pushed him out of the car with a bullet to his face between the eyes from point blank range, and they dumped him on the side of the parking lot, left for dead, believing he was dead. And you'll hear from Alexander Bradley that the one thing he remembers after the shot that took out his eye, entered his skull, he remembers falling, being pushed out of the car on the ground, and looks up through the blood of his one good eye, and he sees the defendant, Aaron Hernandez's leg. He knows it's his leg because it's light skinned. The 2 other guys in the car were dark skinned. He sees the leg pulling into the car, the passenger seat. Aaron Hernandez had been outside of the car, probably pulling him out and throwing him on the ground, believing he was dead. Alexander Bradley did lay there, and it was almost a murder. You'll hear testimony that Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department thought Alexander Bradley was not going to survive. They had the homicide units come out, and they started to investigate the crime. Now, as I said, there are things about Alexander Bradley you will like and not like. And again, Alexander Bradley did as you would probably expect him to do based upon what I've already told you. When the police came to him and said, "Who shot you?" he didn't tell them. Again, Alexander Bradley would tell you, that's not what you do. That's not the street. The street is you handle it your own way. And that's exactly what Alexander Bradley intended to do. So he told the police, I don't know who shot me. But you'll hear the next morning, interestingly enough, when a more polite detective speaks to Alexander Bradley, he actually told that detective, you'll learn, I'm just not going to tell you who did that. So that testimony will change, but he'll tell you what he said. And essentially, ladies and gentlemen, you also hear about the efforts of Aaron Hernandez to cover his tracks for this crime as well, much the same as he had previously in a double murder. He started to make an alibi for himself. You're going to hear testimony from Alexander Bradley's girlfriend that she gets these frantic phone calls and text messages from the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. Where's Alex? I'm trying to get on a plane. I want to take him. I bought him a ticket. Where is he? I don't know where he is. All this stuff is at the hotel. I don't know where he is. I haven't seen him. But you will learn from the evidence that that was an absolute lie. The evidence will be clear, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Alexander Bradley had been with Aaron Hernandez that whole night. There'll be independent evidence to prove that. Aaron Hernandez knew exactly where Alexander Bradley was, but he was creating an alibi for himself. That's what the evidence will show. The one mistake, or the one thing that Aaron Hernandez did not know, was that Alexander Bradley wasn't dead as he intended him to be. Alexander Bradley was still alive. And Alexander Bradley will take that witness stand and tell you about that first couple of phone calls. He'll tell you about the shock and surprise, mostly met by a deafening silence from the defendant when Alexander Bradley called him after getting out of multiple surgeries and said, hey, what's up? Where are you? You will hear what Aaron Hernandez's reaction was. And you will hear what Alexander Bradley said. Now again, Alexander Bradley was never going to go to the police. He again had another means of what he wanted to do. He will make no bones about it. He will be honest, perhaps to a fault. He will take that witness stand, ladies and gentlemen, and Alexander Bradley will tell you, I intended to kill him. I told him I was going to kill him, and I planned to kill him. When I recovered, I lost my eye. He shot my eye out. He almost took me away from my family and my life. I intended to kill him. He will not deny that. He will not hide it. And then he'll tell you something else that, again, might not make him look great, but you have to judge his credibility. He changed his plan at some point. He realized that he had lost his eye, and he was now going to try to get something from the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. He wanted money. Now he'll tell you again, perhaps in too much honesty, that he wasn't sure that even if Aaron Hernandez paid him money, that whether or not he was still going to kill Aaron Hernandez for what he had done to him, for shooting him in the head. But you'll see the text messages back and forth. Text messages between Bradley and Hernandez, where Bradley threatens to kill him. Bradley threatens to sue him. Bradley threatens to maybe talk to the police, although he keeps saying that's not what I do. I'm not a police guy. I'm not going to snitch. But what would the Patriots say if I file a lawsuit? Won't that ruin your career? You'll see all of that, and Alexander Bradley will not hide from that. Ladies and gentlemen, when the text messages are shown to you and they're read to you, I know, I warn you in advance, it may be tedious and long, but it's going to be a very important part of the case when you look at those text messages back and forth between Bradley and Hernandez. Because it's not only what is said in those text messages, it's how it's said, and perhaps more importantly, what is not said in the back and forth between Bradley and Hernandez. You'll see certain references to the double, at least one reference to the double shooting as well. So those messages will come before you. It'll be an important piece of evidence. So you must be asking yourselves now, once the defendant shot Alexander Bradley, it must have been a point where the police finally figured it out and where Aaron Hernandez was not going to get away with murder. But that wasn't the case. Because in February 2013, all up until June of 2013, Alexander Bradley did what he does. Never going to go to the police. And he didn't. And it wasn't until, ladies and gentlemen, a lot of luck that the Boston Police Department managed to key in on the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. You'll learn that in 2013, June of 2013, certain things happened that at least made the Boston police look at Aaron Hernandez. Now you'll hear evidence and testimony that they knew Aaron Hernandez had entered the Cure nightclub, but he was only in there for 10 minutes. And yes, he came in at about the same time as the victims, but he left so quickly, he had no indication to believe he was involved. But you'll learn that once his name came up as someone to be looked at, the Boston Police Department scoured the video. They scoured the video that you will see of the parking garage. When they scoured that video of the parking garage, they saw a silver SUV entering that parking garage. A silver SUV with Rhode Island plates. A silver SUV that from the video evidence they could show that was being driven by the defendant, Aaron Hernandez. And what did they do? They got the license plate of that silver SUV, and traced it back to the leasing company, the dealership that had given that to Aaron Hernandez. And what did they find out? Oh, geez, that car has been missing. Aaron Hernandez, despite the fact that it was repeatedly requested that he bring that car in for servicing, he never did. In fact, you'll hear evidence that his agent was trying to buy the car, that 4Runner. The 4Runner that had been basically disappeared and stuck in a garage for over a year. You'll hear evidence that at that point the police began trying to find the silver SUV. They got some more luck. June 26, 2013, an unrelated investigation, detectives did a search warrant of guess where? 114 Lake Avenue in Bristol, Connecticut. What did they find in the garage? The silver 4Runner with the Rhode Island plates. Cobwebs, battery dead, but the interior very clean. No fingerprints in the entire interior. You'll hear testimony of other than some rich detail on the road. Otherwise, no fingerprints at all. That car, the evidence will show, had been cleaned well. And another stroke of luck. As the police were on the move trying to solve this case, so too on the move was the murder weapon. You will hear evidence that on June 21st, 2013, an 18-year-old woman named Jaylene Diaz-Ramos, who was born and raised, guess where? Bristol, Connecticut. She was driving a car on Route Interstate 91 in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. And again, by a stroke of luck, she got into a car accident. She was injured. She was taken to the hospital. The state police did, as part of their policy, they performed an inventory search of that car. And in the trunk, they found a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson revolver. That revolver was tested forensically. The evidence you will hear is that that firearm was the murder weapon to a reasonable degree of ballistic certainty. That was the weapon used by the defendant to kill Daniel D'Abreu, Safiro Furtado, and shoot Aquilino in the arm, Aquilino Freire. And the police started to research Jaylene Diaz-Ramos. You will hear evidence about that. And guess what? Jaylene Diaz-Ramos, you will hear evidence, has a direct link to guess where? 114 Lake Avenue in Bristol. A direct link. Her closest childhood friend is actually one of the Singleton cousins. He spent a lot of time at 114 Lake Avenue. He had been there. He knew the defendant. The defendant was linked to the murder weapon. And you'll hear other evidence of the police investigation. And you'll ultimately hear that they tracked down Bradley. They figured out who he was in the surveillance video. They didn't even know who he was initially. And once they figured out who he was, you'll hear the testimony of how he was brought in and how he tried to avoid being brought in. How he was issued a subpoena. He refused to come under the subpoena. He was arrested. He was brought in. And this is an important point in the case, in the investigation, ladies and gentlemen, is what happens with Alexander Bradley when he was brought in. Because as you may have figured out, or you soon know from the evidence, Alexander Bradley ended up entering into a deal. He ultimately got immunity to testify as to what he saw, what he did that night. But what's important for each and every one of you as you receive evidence in this case, as you see the testimony, as you size up Alexander Bradley's testimony, pay close attention to the hows and the whys and the whats that led to Alexander Bradley entering into an agreement. You're going to learn that when he was brought in, he wasn't brought in custody on this case. He wasn't told, you're part of this murder, you're going to be charged. He was brought in as a witness. You're going to learn that when he was brought in, he gave an over 2-hour statement laying out some very, very damaging details about himself. The fact that he was the driver during that incident. Something that was a fact not even known to the police at the time, they'll hear. He admitted to being the driver during the murder. And the only thing that he asked for, you'll learn from the evidence in return, is to be given immunity and not have the ability to be prosecuted if he's forced to testify. But you'll learn from the evidence that that was not done right away. That he gave the statement, he was not promised he wouldn't be prosecuted at that point. He still could have been prosecuted. But it was 10 days later that he came back with immunity to testify. And you'll hear evidence of what was promised and what wasn't. Again, I'm not going to get into that now, that wouldn't be proper, but as you listen to Alexander Bradley's testimony on the witness stand, again, keep in mind what he said, when he said it, how he said it, and do the same when he testifies as a witness. Ladies and gentlemen, I expect Alexander Bradley in many ways, probably starting with an opening statement from Mr. Baez if he chooses to do one right after I'm done. A lot of it is going to be Alexander Bradley, put Alexander Bradley on trial. That's fine. I welcome you to do that. Listen to the evidence from Alexander Bradley. Look at him as he testifies. Watch him. Look to the corroborating evidence of what Alexander Bradley has to say. There is a lot of it. And at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, you will find, I suspect from the evidence, that maybe he's not the most likable person in the world. But I suggest to you that you will find his testimony credible based upon the independent corroborating evidence and your own common sense, your life experience. That's one other thing I should mention. When you came through the door as jurors in this case, you didn't leave your common sense, your life experience at the door. You're allowed to use that as you sit there as fair, impartial, objective jurors. And you will use that same common sense the size of Alexander Bradley and determine whether or not he's telling you the truth. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, this case will not only come down to Alexander Bradley. There is much other evidence from many different sources. Phone records, surveillance video, forensic evidence, other witness evidence. There's a lot of it. It will come from many sources, and it will all point in one inescapable conclusion and direction. The defendant, Aaron Hernandez, committed the crimes. The Commonwealth will prove beyond a reasonable doubt his link to the murder weapon. The Commonwealth will prove beyond a reasonable doubt his link to the murder car. The Commonwealth will prove beyond a reasonable doubt his interaction with those two dead victims inside the club, not just from the mouth of Alexander Bradley, but from others. The evidence will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Aaron Hernandez is the one who pulled the trigger, killed the man on that fateful night. Ladies and gentlemen, let me warn you of one more thing. At the conclusion of this case, although the evidence will be clear beyond a reasonable doubt that Aaron Hernandez committed these heinous acts, committed these killings, one thing that I suspect will not be clear is why. The senselessness of it. And all I can tell you with that is don't get bogged down. Don't try to make sense of murder. No murder makes sense. None. And especially this one. This one doesn't make any sense either. A promising career of an athlete, star, could do something like this over such a small thing as a spilled drink, a sense of being tested or tried. Don't try to make sense of murder. Murder doesn't make sense. And as you ask yourselves questions, though, about the motive of Aaron Hernandez, why he would do something as appalling as this, ask yourself the same questions as you look at the testimony and listen to the testimony of Alexander Bradley. Why would he do it? And the answer to that will be much more clear than the answer of Aaron Hernandez. He wouldn't. There was no reason whatsoever. So to the extent that you are told that Alexander Bradley was really the killer, you're the judges of the evidence, no one else. Ladies and gentlemen, at the conclusion of the case, I will have a chance to speak to you once again. I will ask you to simply follow the evidence, to follow the judge's instructions, to speak the truth through your verdict. And the truth, as I said, from the evidence, not from speculation or conjecture. The truth from the evidence will be that that man, defendant Aaron Hernandez, is guilty of the crimes charged. Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to excuse you for just 5 minutes.
All right, please.